Master Sergeant Hans Hoagland saw the blip before his pilot did. It sat at the top edge of the radar scope, a small bright smear sliding through the dark, and it was climbing toward them. The night air over North Korea was black and starless. There was no moon. There was no horizon. There was only the green glow of the scope and the steady hiss of two tired engines that were never built to win this kind of fight. His pilot was Major William Stratton. The aircraft they flew was slow. It was fat through the middle. It had straight wings in an age when every dangerous thing in the sky had swept ones. The men who flew it called it the Whale. Somewhere ahead of them in that darkness was a MiG-15, the fastest killer in Korea, and for 2 years that machine had owned the night without a serious challenge. Stratton and Hoagland were about to test whether that was still true. It was the night of November 2, 1952. They were flying over enemy ground, far past the front line, in an aircraft most fighter pilots openly mocked. And in a few minutes they would do something that had never been done before in the history of air combat. Before we go any further, I want to ask you for something small. Cold War Impact is a small history channel, and the reach on these deep-dive documentaries has been dropping lately. If you find this kind of carefully researched military history worth your time, please subscribe, leave a comment, and share the video with someone who would enjoy it. Every single interaction tells the algorithm this work matters, and it lets me keep making films like this one. Now let us go back to the dark sky over Korea. To understand why 2 men in a slow jet were the answer to a problem that had humiliated the most powerful air force on Earth, we have to start with the machine that created the problem. We have to start with the MiG-15. When the Korean War began in June 1950, the United States Air Force expected to own the sky. It had done so over Germany and Japan only 5 years earlier, and the habit of victory ran deep. Its main striking weapon was the Boeing B-29 Superfortress, the 4-engine heavy bomber that had burned the cities of Japan to the ground and carried the atomic bombs that ended the Second World War. In the first months over Korea, the B-29 did exactly what it had always done. It flew in daylight, in tight formations, high above the reach of the guns, and it leveled bridges, factories, marshalling yards, and supply dumps almost as it pleased. North Korea's small propeller air force could not climb high enough or fast enough to trouble it. For a brief season, the bomber was king again, just as it had been over the Pacific. Then, in November 1950, something silver and swept-winged came down out of the high, cold air near the Yalu River, and the war in the sky changed in a single afternoon. The MiG-15 was a Soviet jet fighter, and to the men who first met it in the air, it was a genuine shock. It could climb higher than anything the Americans had in the theater. It was faster in a dive. It carried heavy cannon, one 37mm gun and two 23mm guns, an armament chosen for one specific purpose, to tear a heavy bomber apart in a single firing pass. This was not an accident of design. The Soviet engineers had studied the B-29 with enormous care. They had even copied the American bomber, almost rivet for rivet, into a machine of their own. So when they sat down to build the fighter that would defend Soviet skies, they built it knowing precisely what it would one day have to destroy. They built it to kill something that looked exactly like the Superfortress. There was another secret folded inside the MiG, one the Americans suspected but could not say aloud. Many of the men flying those fighters were not North Korean, and they were not Chinese. They were Soviet pilots, hardened veterans of the air war against Germany, flying in secret from bases on the far side of the Yalu River, inside Manchuria, where American aircraft were forbidden to follow. The bomber crews could hear unfamiliar voices crackling on the radio. The intelligence officers had their suspicions, but to admit openly that Soviet pilots were shooting down American airmen risked turning a war in Korea into a direct war between the United States and the Soviet Union, the very thing both sides most wanted to avoid. So officially, the men in the MiGs did not exist. Unofficially, they were among the most dangerous fighter pilots alive. The B-29 crews learned the truth the hard way, and the day they learned it has carried a grim name ever since. It is remembered as Black Tuesday. On October 23, 1951, the Air Force sent a formation of B-29 bombers against an airfield called Namsi, deep in the northwest corner of Korea. In the dangerous belt of sky, the bomber crews had begun calling MiG Alley. The mission had a heavy escort of jet fighters flying above and around it. It was not enough. A large force of MiG-15s, flown by experienced Soviet pilots, punched through the escort and fell on the bombers in a single overwhelming rush. In a matter of minutes, the formation was ripped apart. Several superfortresses were shot down over the target. Others turned for home so badly mauled that they never flew again, crash landing or being scrapped where they limped down. Of the bombers sent on that mission, the great majority were lost or written off, and many airmen were dead or wounded. Measured as a share of the force committed, it was the worst single day in the history of American strategic bombing. The lesson was brutal, and it was simple. The B-29 could no longer survive in daylight over northern Korea, not with a fighter escort, not in a tight defensive formation, not with anything the Air Force could wrap around it. The MiG had taken the daytime sky away, and it had taken it completely. So the Americans did the only thing left to do. They moved the bombing to the night. For a while, the darkness worked beautifully. The B-29 carried bombing radar that let it find a target and strike it without ever seeing the ground below. The crews could navigate, aim, and release in total blackness, guided by the glow of their own scopes. And at night, the MiG was suddenly half blind, because the MiG-15 carried no radar of its own. Its pilot hunted with his eyes alone, and in a moonless sky over a country that switched off every light it could, a pair of eyes was simply not enough. Through the winter and into the early spring, the superfortresses slipped through the dark like ghosts, struck their targets, and went home. Bomber losses fell away to almost nothing. The crews began to breathe again, and the planners told themselves they had found the answer. The Soviets refused to accept it. If their fighters could not see in the dark, then they would build, on the ground, the eyes their pilots lacked in the air. And the system they assembled was patient, methodical, and lethal. It began far below the bombers. The Soviet command moved batteries of searchlights and ground radar stations into the corridors the B-29s used night after night. The radar would find a bomber in the black sky and pass its position to the searchlight crews waiting in the dark. Then, at the chosen moment, dozens of searchlight beams would stab upward all at once and converge on the single aircraft, trapping it in a blinding cage of white light. Pinned in those beams, the big silver bomber was suddenly naked, visible for miles in every direction, blinded itself by the glare, and helpless to hide. And waiting in the darkness above, already guided into position by the ground controllers, was the MiG, dropping out of the night onto a target lit up like a stage. For the men inside a conned bomber, those moments were a special kind of nightmare. One instant they were flying through familiar anonymous black. The next, the whole interior of the aircraft flooded with a hard white glare brighter than noon, pouring in through every window and blister. The gunners were dazzled and half-blinded, robbed of the night vision they needed to spot an attacker. The pilot could do little but hold his course toward the target, or throw the heavy bomber into desperate, wallowing turns that bled off speed and altitude he could not spare. And every man aboard understood, in that flood of light, that somewhere in the darkness, just beyond the glare, a fighter was already lining up its guns. They could not see it. They could only wait for the cannon shells to start arriving. It was a feeling of helplessness that the bomber crews never forgot, the sensation of being pinned to a wall and lit up for execution while the executioner stayed hidden. The man who became the face of this hunting system was a Soviet pilot named Anatoly Karelin. He belonged to a small, specially trained cadre of night flyers, and he was extraordinarily good at the work. While the great mass of MiG combat happened in daylight against American fighters, Karelin practiced his trade in the dark, diving on bombers held fast in the searchlight beams, closing to short range where he could not miss, and firing those heavy cannon into the lit-up hull until it burned. He would be credited with destroying multiple B-29s in the night. The work was not without its terrors for him either. On at least one occasion, the bomber's gunners found him in return, and Carolyn flew home with his MiG, riddled with 50 caliber holes, barely flying at all. But he kept coming back, night after night, and so did the others trained alongside him. The trap closed for the first terrible time in June 1952. On the night of June 10, Soviet radar picked up a stream of B-29s crossing into the killing ground on the way to their targets. The searchlights stood ready, the beams snapped on and locked, and the MiGs came down out of the black. In a single coordinated attack, the bombers were savaged. Several were shot down or so badly damaged that they barely survived the long flight home. It was Black Tuesday all over again, except that now it was happening in the one place the bomber crews had believed was still safe. The horror had followed them into the dark. The Air Force suspended the night raids while it tried to understand what had just happened. The arithmetic had turned suddenly sickeningly clear. The MiG had taken the daylight sky months before. Now it was reaching into the night and taking that too, and the United States had nothing in Korea that could stop it after sundown. The most powerful air force on Earth was being told, by a single type of enemy fighter, the exact hours during which it was permitted to fly. That was an intolerable position for any air force to be in, and everyone in the chain of command knew it. What the Americans needed was a fighter that could do in the dark precisely what the MiG could not. They needed an aircraft that could find another aircraft in total blackness, track it as it twisted and ran, and shoot it down, all without the pilot ever needing to lay eyes on it. They needed a fighter that carried its own radar, and a crewman trained to read that radar like a second pair of eyes. And here is the strange, almost familiar shape of this story, the pattern that runs through so many turning points in war. The weapon they needed already existed. It had existed for years. It was simply being built for a different service, kept for a different mission, and stationed in the wrong part of the world. But before that weapon ever reached the fight, the Air Force reached for everything else within arm's length first, and one by one, everything else came up short. The earliest answers leaned on older machines, leftovers from the last war. There was the F-82 Twin Mustang, an odd-looking night fighter built by joining two propeller fighters at the wing, with a radar operator riding in one of the cockpits. Early in the war, it had done useful work, but the type was worn out now and starved of spare parts, and against a jet, it had no hope at all. There was the F-7F Tiger Cat, a big, powerful twin-engine propeller night fighter flown by the Marines. It was fast for a propeller aircraft, and it carried radar, and it did score against the slow wood and fabric biplanes the enemy floated over American airfields after dark to drop small bombs and rob the men of sleep. But set against a MiG-15, the Tiger Cat was hopelessly outclassed. It could not fly fast enough or climb high enough to bring a jet to battle. There was the night-fighting Corsair, yet another propeller machine, deadly to slow intruders and entirely useless against a jet. Then came the aircraft that was supposed to be the true answer, the modern one, the Lockheed F-94 Starfire. It was a sleek two-seat jet interceptor, and on paper, it was exactly what the crisis demanded. It had radar. It had a radar operator in the back seat to work it. It had real jet speed. But it carried a problem that grounded its promise, and the problem was secrecy. The Starfire's radar and its automatic fire control system were considered among the most advanced and most classified equipment the Air Force owned. The fear was simple. If a Starfire went down in enemy territory, the Soviets might recover that technology intact. So for a long stretch of the war, the F-94 was flatly forbidden to fly over enemy ground at all. It could guard the rear areas and the bomber bases, but it was not allowed to go north, into the dark corridors where the B-29s were actually dying. By the time that restriction was finally eased, late in the war, a second weakness had shown itself. The Starfire was a hot, slippery, fast interceptor, and that very quickness made it dangerous and clumsy when chasing something slow. One squadron commander died trying to throttle back behind a crawling biplane, stalling his fast jet out of the night sky in the attempt. The F-94 would eventually draw blood over Korea, but it never became the steady shield the bombers so desperately needed. So the fast machines, the famous machines, the obvious machines, had all been tried, and not one of them had solved the problem. The answer, when it finally came, arrived from the Navy and the Marine Corps, and it came wrapped in an airframe that fighter pilots openly laughed at the first time they laid eyes on it. The Douglas F3D Skyknight had been designed back in the late 1940s to satisfy a very particular request. The Navy had asked for a jet-powered night fighter that could operate from the deck of an aircraft carrier and carry a large, powerful radar into the dark. A gifted engineer named Ed Heinemann led the team that answered the call, and from the start, the radar dictated the entire shape of the aircraft. A powerful radar of that era needed a large antenna dish, and a large dish needed a wide, deep nose to house it. So the Skyknight grew a broad, barrel-chested fuselage that very quickly earned it the affectionate insult of a nickname, Willie the Whale. To operate the radar in flight, the second crewman did not sit behind the pilot in a separate cockpit, but right beside him, the two men packed shoulder to shoulder in a wide side-by-side cabin. The wings were dead straight, with no sweep at all. The whole machine was subsonic, heavy, and slow. It did not even have ejection seats. To escape a crippled Skyknight, the two men had to unstrap, crawl to a chute set into the belly of the aircraft, and drop out through the bottom into the night. Measured against every quality fighter pilots traditionally prized, speed, climb, agility, and sheer good looks, the Skyknight lost to the MiG-15 on all counts. But the fighter pilots were measuring the wrong things entirely, because not one of those qualities decided a battle in the dark. What decided a battle in the dark was the radar, and the radar in the belly of that ugly whale was, for its moment in history, something close to magic. It was not a single radar but three separate systems working together as one. The first was a search radar mounted in the nose that could sweep the black sky ahead of the aircraft and find another machine as far away as 20 miles. The second was a narrow, precise tracking and gun aiming radar that took over once the target was close, holding it tightly and telling the pilot exactly where to point his guns. The third radar faced backward, watching the tail, ready to warn the crew the instant anything tried to slide in behind them and turn the hunters into the hunted. Search, track, and guard the rear, all of it done on instruments, all of it without the men ever needing to see the enemy with their eyes. No other fighter flying over Korea carried anything remotely like it. This was the entire secret of the thing, and it was a complete reversal of everything that had made the MiG so terrible. The MiG-15 was faster, it climbed higher, and it hit harder. But in the dark it was very nearly blind. It needed men on the ground to find its prey, and a wall of searchlights to reveal it before its pilot could even begin to aim. The Skyknight needed none of that. It carried its own eyes into the night, and it carried a second man whose entire job was to read those electronic eyes, while the pilot concentrated on flying and shooting. In the darkness, two men who could both see would always beat one man who could not, no matter how much faster the blind man's aircraft might be. That single truth is why the general commanding the bomber campaign asked, specifically and by name, for the Skyknight and its two-man crew to escort his B-29s through the night. The slow, homely whale possessed the one thing that actually won battles after sundown. It could see the enemy before the enemy could see it, the oldest and deadliest advantage in all of air combat. The squadron that carried the Skyknight into that fight was a Marine Night Fighter unit with one of the finest names of the war. They were Marine Night Fighter Squadron 513, and they called themselves the Flying Nightmares. In 1952, they handed in their tired propeller Tiger Cats, took up the new jets, and went to work from bases in South Korea, sending their whales north into the dark to ride as close escort over the bomber stream. Their task was to slot themselves into the black sky between the superfortresses and the waiting MiGs, to patrol the unlit corridors the bombers flew, and to hunt down anything that came out of the night to kill the men they were guarding. It was lonely, exhausting, and almost wholly invisible work, flown far from any friendly eyes, decided entirely by what two men could read on a glowing screen. The tactics they worked out were careful and layered. On a given night, the Skyknights might split their effort. with some whales flying a barrier patrol between the bomber stream and the known MiG bases, standing guard across the routes the enemy fighters would have to use, while others rode directly with the bombers or circled over the target waiting for trouble. The radar operator carried the heavier burden in many ways. While the pilot flew the aircraft and watched for the gun solution, the operator lived inside the scope, his whole world reduced to the slow sweep of the search radar and the faint returns crawling across it. He had to tell a real contact from ground clutter and electronic noise, judge its course and speed from nothing but a moving smear of light, and talk his pilot onto it through a stream of calm, precise instructions, all while knowing that the tail warning radar might at any second announce a MiG sliding into position behind them. It was a strange, claustrophobic kind of combat, fought in near silence at the speed of a quiet conversation, and it demanded a trust between the two men in that cramped cabin that few other crews ever had to build. Which brings us back at last to Major William Stratton and Master Sergeant Hans Hoagland, and to that small climbing blip on the radar scope on the night of November 2, 1952. Hoagland called the contact in a flat, steady voice, reading off the range and the bearing, guiding his pilot through the blackness toward an enemy that neither man could see with his eyes. The search radar held the target as they closed the distance. Then the tracking radar took the handoff and locked on, and the blip on the scope steadied into a hard, sure point of light. Stratton followed Hoagland's quiet directions, easing the slow Skyknight into a firing position behind a machine that existed for him only as that single glowing dot. He never saw it. He did not need to see it. He pressed the trigger, and the 420mm cannon in the whale's belly hammered out into the dark, and the target came apart and tumbled away into the blackness far below. It was the first time in the history of air warfare that one jet had found and shot down another jet at night, hunting on radar alone, with no help from the ground and no glimpse of the target until it was already dying. A slow, mocked, straight-winged aircraft that pilots had nicknamed after a whale had just done something the sleek and feared MiG-15 could not do at all. There is an honest complication that belongs here, because this channel does not smooth over the awkward corners of history to make a cleaner story. The American crew reported the machine they had shot down as a particular type of Soviet jet. Soviet records that came to light long after the war suggest the aircraft was in fact a MiG-15, and that its pilot managed to nurse the badly damaged fighter back home rather than dying in the fall. For that reason, some historians hand the strict honor of the first fully confirmed night jet versus jet radar kill to a different Skyknight crew a few nights later. But the detail that mattered most to the men inside the bombers was not in any dispute at all. As of that first week of November, the MiG no longer owned the night. Something out there could hunt it in the dark now, and that something was flying on their side. The proof followed almost at once. On the night of November 7, 1952, another Skyknight crew, Captain Oliver Davis flying with his radar operator, found a MiG-15 in the darkness northwest of Pyongyang and shot it down cleanly from 19,000 feet. The Soviet pilot ejected and survived, and his own side later confirmed the loss in their records. Because that very first claim a few nights earlier is clouded by the question of exactly what was hit, many careful accounts treat this November 7 victory as the first truly confirmed radar-guided night jet kill in history. Either way, the point was made twice within a single week. The flying nightmares had proven the impossible, and then proven it again. The whale could find and kill the MiG in the dark. The kills kept coming through that winter, and every one of them belonged to two men rather than one. That was the strange new rhythm of this kind of war. A pilot to fly the aircraft and fire the guns, and beside him a radar man calling the hunt blow by blow, the two of them functioning as a single weapon. It was a different thing entirely from the lone fighter ace of legend, the single pilot dueling in the sun. This was a quieter, more clinical kind of killing, done by teams in the dark. On the night of December 10, 1952, a Skyknight crewed by First Lieutenant Joseph Corvey and Sergeant Dan George did something stranger still than that first kill. They tracked an enemy aircraft, a slow biplane intruder droning through the night, and destroyed it without ever once seeing it with their eyes. The entire engagement, finding the target, closing the range, settling into position, aiming, and firing, was flown from start to finish on the radar scope in total darkness. It was the first time in history that an aircraft had been shot out of the sky on radar alone, with no visual contact at any point in the attack. The machine they killed was a flimsy thing of wood and fabric, almost a toy beside a jet, and yet the way it died was a clear glimpse of the entire future of air combat. The human eye had been quietly replaced by the instrument. From that night forward, darkness and cloud would never again be a reliable place to hide. Through January 1953, the nightmares kept scoring. On January 12, Major Elswin Dunn and Master Sergeant Lawrence Fortin downed a MiG-15 while flying escort for the bombers. Later that same month, Captain James Weaver and Master Sergeant Robert Becker took another out of the dark. And at the end of January, the squadron's own commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Conley, flying with Master Sergeant James Scott, claimed yet another MiG. The Air Force, finally understanding what it had in its hands, doubled the number of Skyknights stationed in Korea so that every bomber raid could have a proper escort every single night it flew. The whole shape of the night war had turned over. A few months earlier, the MiG had been dictating the very hours the B-29s were allowed into the sky. Now it was Marine radar crews who patrolled the darkness over enemy territory, hunting the hunters, and the bombers flew behind their shield. The night was not bloodless, though, and this is exactly where the bold promise in the title of this story has to be handled with real care, because the truth is both more complicated and more impressive than any slogan. The Skyknight crews were not untouchable, and it would be a lie to pretend they were. On the night of January 16, 1953, a whale flown by Captain George Cross and his radar operator was caught by a MiG and shot up so badly that it only barely dragged itself back to base. And later in the war, on the night of May 29, 1953, a Skyknight crewed by Captain James Brown and Sergeant James Harrell was shot down over enemy territory by a Chinese MiG-15. Both men were lost, so it is simply not true to say that no Skyknight was ever destroyed in combat. One was, and good men died inside it, and they deserve to be remembered honestly rather than written out of the story to make it tidier. What is true, and what the historical record fully and firmly supports, is something more precise and in many ways more remarkable than the simple slogan. Across the long stretch from early 1953 through to the very end of the war, while the Skyknights flew their nightly escort over the B-29 raids, the Air Force did not lose a single one of those night bombers to an enemy fighter. The one task the Whale had been sent north to perform, to keep the bombers alive in the dark, it performed completely and without a single failure. Squadron 513 finished the war, credited with 6 enemy aircraft destroyed in the night sky, against one of its own number lost in air-to-air combat. 6-1, in the dark, flying the slowest and homeliest jet in the entire theatre, deep over enemy ground, against the most feared fighter of the whole war. As a shield for the men it was sent to protect, the Skyknight never once let an enemy through. That is the real and defensible meaning of the claim that the radar jet never lost. It does not mean the Whale was invincible. It means it never lost a bomber that it was guarding. It never failed the men flying behind it. When the guns at last fell silent with the armistice of July 27, 1953, the full accounting could begin, and the numbers told a quiet, lopsided story. That ungainly Skyknight, the aircraft the fighter pilots had laughed at, had scored more air-to-air kills than any other Navy or Marine aircraft type in the entire Korean War. Across the whole conflict, the B-29 force had paid a heavy price in bombers lost to the enemy, but the worst of that bleeding had come in those earlier daylight months and in the first shock of the searchlight nights, before anyone had learned how to fight in the dark. In the final stretch of the war, under the patient cover of the radar Whale, the night belonged once again to the bombers. The machine no one had wanted had done the thing the fast and famous machines could not. The men who flew it, mostly went on with their lives without parades or headlines. Oliver Davis, who had scored that clean, confirmed kill in the first week of November, stayed close to the aircraft for years afterward. In a fitting closing of the whole circle, he was chosen to fly the very last official mission of the Skyknight in Marine service. Many years later, the first MiG killer, flying the old machine gently into honorable retirement. On the other side of that vanished front line, Anatoly Karelin, the Soviet night ace, who had been the terror of the searchlight corridors, survived the war and was named a hero of the Soviet Union for his deadly work in the dark over Korea. The men on both sides who fought that secret war of glowing scopes and stabbing searchlight beams were, almost every one of them, unknown to the public then and remain so now. The night war produced no famous faces and inspired no posters. It was fought far away, over a blacked-out country, by quiet men staring into green glass. The aircraft itself simply refused to die. The Skyknight proved far too useful to throw away when its fighting days were done. Slow and ugly as it had always been, that great barrel of a fuselage had room inside for equipment, and in the years after Korea, the airframe was rebuilt into an electronic warfare machine, an aircraft that hunted and jammed enemy radar and shielded other aircraft with invisible beams rather than cannon fire. In that new role, the very same basic airframe that had stalked MiGs through the Korean dark went on to fly in the skies over Vietnam more than a decade later, the only American jet fighter from the Korean War that also served in that next long conflict. The Whale outlasted nearly every sleek and celebrated fighter that had once flown rings around it. It was finally retired in 1970, more than 20 years after its first flight, an old machine that had quietly outlived its own mockers. And the question that the night war over Korea first answered has never truly closed, because the place where it was fought has never known a real and lasting peace. The Korean peninsula remains, to this very day, one of the most heavily armed and most closely watched stretches of sky on the entire planet. The line where the fighting froze in 1953 still cuts across the land exactly where it stopped. The confrontation never ended, it only changed its tools. In the dark over Korea, the decisive edge had come down to one thing above all others. It was the ability to see the enemy first, on radar, before he could see you, and to strike from inside that hidden advantage. That single idea, detect first and shoot first, is now the founding logic of every modern fighter that patrols those same contested skies. Today, South Korea flies advanced stealth fighters bought from the United States, aircraft built so completely around radar and electronic sensors that the pilot's own eyes have become almost the least important instrument in the cockpit. South Korea has also begun building a modern fighter of its own, a homegrown machine with a powerful radar set into its nose, a distant descendant of the very principle the homely Skyknight proved over these skies 70 years before. The first of those new fighters rolled off the production line in 2026. North Korea, on the far side of that frozen line, still flies a force of mostly aging aircraft, including old MiGs, not so very distant in spirit from the ones that once terrorized the bombers in the searchlight nights. But it makes up for the weakness of its air force the same way the Soviets once did, with a dense and layered network of ground radar and surface-to-air missiles designed to find and destroy anything that dares to cross into its sky. The searchlight and the radar station of 1952 have become the missile battery and the early warning array of the present day, but the underlying idea behind them has not shifted at all. Control the night, see first, deny the sky to the other side. The weapons themselves have changed beyond all recognition. The thinking behind them has not moved an inch. In 1952, the answer to a blind and lethally fast killer in the dark turned out to be a slow, patient, seeing aircraft carrying 2 men and a radar, an ugly machine that nearly everyone underestimated. Right up until the night it proved that the power to see will always beat the power merely to run. The MiG-15 had taken the day, and then it had reached up and taken the night as well, and for a few genuinely frightening months, it looked as though no one could ever take the darkness back. Then, a fat, straight-winged jet that pilots had laughed at, flew north into that very darkness, found the unkillable enemy waiting on a glowing screen, and shot it out of the sky without ever once laying eyes upon it. The Knight, it turned out, had never really belonged to the fastest aircraft at all. It belonged to the one that could see in the dark, and on that long, frozen, sleepless peninsula, where the lesson was first written in fire and radar light, it is a lesson that has never, in all the years since, been allowed to fade.